good afternoon to our audience and to our guest today, Felix Shebok. Welcome. Felix Shebok is a China Research Fellow and Project Manager at the Association for International Affairs in Prague, Czech Republic. His research interests include China's domestic and foreign policy relations between China and Central and Eastern European countries and China's foreign policy rhetoric. We welcome you, Philip, today to our event on China's impact in Central and Eastern Europe, the Three Seas Initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative, and beyond.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here.
So, to set the scene, first of all, I would like to ask you, how would you characterize China's growing presence and influence in Central Eastern Europe? I mean, across the region and particularly in V4 countries, namely Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic.
So maybe I would, if I may, challenge the premise of a growing influence of China. I mean, it's a mixed picture across the region. So if we're talking about Central and Eastern Europe, there are different trends around. So, you could talk about the V4 countries, you could talk about the Baltics, you could talk about the Balkan countries, and the landscape is quite different there. What I would say is that the engagement with China in the region has undergone a huge change over the past decade. So you could say that before basically 2020, China was not much of an actor here in the region. And there were some efforts by specific countries to develop relations even before that, for example, by Hungary and other countries. But China was not really seen as a big player. This changed around 2012, when China created this so-called 16+1 format. Then it changed into 17+1. Now it's 14+1. But the official name is basically the format for China CEE cooperation. And this meant basically the huge growth of Chinese presence across the region. China, for the first time, approached the region of Central and Eastern Europe as one continuum, as one geopolitical unit. And this was met also by the interest of the countries in the region to especially develop economic relations. So I would say the years after that really were the high point of China's engagement here in the region. But in the several in recent years, we have seen the change of dynamics. While 10 years ago, China was seen mainly as an economic partner, as an economic opportunity, and the basically concerns related to China were mostly of ideological nature, based on political differences, human rights issues in China, and all that. In the recent years, we have seen the growth of seeing China as a geopolitical actor, and mostly negatively, and of course the growth of security issues, which was not really the case 10 years ago. So now we have a different kinds of engagement. We can say that there are countries who are very much closely cooperating with China, especially Hungary and Serbia. Then we have countries which have turned completely, you could say, against China, as Czech Republic or Lithuania. And then there are countries somewhere in the middle where I would say there's Poland. That's the most interesting example. So it's really a mixed picture. But I would say the most important and interesting takeaway is that really the form of engagement, the very factors that these countries in the region are taking into consideration when engaging China has changed very significantly, dramatically, you could say, over the past few years. And when I was talking about the geopolitical factors, of course, the China's position on the war of Russia against Ukraine is a very important factor there.
Right, right. So you mentioned that, I mean, the Chinese presence in Europe, well, particularly Central Eastern Europe, I mean, it is well known that Germany, for instance, I mean, has a good bond. So, I mean, we can basically already take for given that the relationship with more Central Western European countries was already materialized. So could we speak about the extension of this influence, or how can we visualize this presence? I mean, you speak about economic investment, but do we actually see more than just foreign direct investment, because in Central Europe, what the numbers say is that it is less about bringing in Chinese industries, but more about foreign direct investment. I mean, as a direct injection of money to these countries. So how do we actually materialize, I mean, this influence? I mean, what is the end goal, let's say?
Okay, so in terms of the patterns of Chinese presence here, you could say that, as I was mentioning, there was this interest of in economic cooperation, mostly about increasing the exports of the CE countries to China, and basically attracting Chinese foreign direct investment. Uh, we have seen that the Chinese presence in terms of investment has grown, but for most of the countries, China has not really become a major investor. So you could say that some of the hopes that basically the structural uh, economic relationship, or basically the web of relationships that many of the countries in the region have found themselves in 10 years ago, has not really changed, meaning that China would become a major actor there. Of course, also there's been some changes because for China, the region traditionally was kind of in the middle in terms of what China is interested in. So you could say that China's economic engagement abroad has been driven, on one hand, by its basically efforts to try to secure, raw materials, natural resources, and all that. On the other hand, trying to acquire, established companies, basically to insert itself into the regional supply chains and all that, getting some, valuable know-how, technologies, and all that. Central and Eastern Europe is kind of in the middle, where China did not really have much in terms of what it was interested in. So also what China was offering, for example, the typical offer that China is used to in Latin America, Africa, or Southeast Asia, basically offering these huge loans for infrastructure projects that are tied to Chinese companies actually being contractors on them. This At first there was some interest into this by countries in the region, but then they realized this is not really that interesting for them, because they can actually get much better funding, for example, within the EU through structural funds, or, or just basically on the international market. Um, so this has also meant that a lot of this hope about big Chinese infrastructure projects has not really happened. But there's also caveats, especially in the Balkans, especially in Serbia specifically, where China has been active quite a lot on that front, and also in Hungary, which we
Right.
know there's this Belgrade Budapest railway project, which is kind of a maybe the only example of actually China building a cross-border connectivity project in the region, despite China saying like its engagement here was all about connectivity. But what we have seen, it's mostly been about bilateral economic engagement as opposed to like building some cross-regional projects, especially related to connectivity and infrastructure. Um,
Right.
so, and what we're seeing, but it's kind of a new trend the past few years, and this is related to basically global patterns of Chinese economic engagement and investment abroad, is that China is becoming a very important player, and it already is a very important player in terms of green industries, especially, for example, electromobility. So we're actually seeing that while we did not have much of Chinese, greenfield investments before, for example, in the V4 countries, this is now changing. So in Hungary, there is this huge battery plant that is being built by CATL. In Slovakia, a huge investment by Volvo, which is actually owned by Geely, a Chinese company. In Poland, there's this cooperation with BYD. So I think there's also this new pattern emerging that perhaps these countries, especially now talking about V4 countries, we have not seen that much Chinese investment in terms of especially the sectors we were interested in. China actually building new factories and bringing new employment. We haven't seen much of that, but we're seeing that this might now be changing with Chinese involvement in these industries, especially considering the important place that V4 countries play in Germany-centered, automobile construction production chains.
Right. I mean, now recently Germany signed a new commercial deal. I mean, with a Chinese company precisely to push for this automobile industry, and I mean, with a clear path and with good reasons. I mean, they wanted this partnership. Now let's focus on geopolitics. I mean, you mentioned the development since 2012 on the 16 plus one. Then it went down to 14 plus 1. Now, in these years, 2012 to 2015, we didn't see much of a, let's say, counterbalance until the Three Seas Initiative was introduced, and somehow the narrative that was taken, also because of the US investment and the US support, was as a mean to counterbalance Chinese presence. Now, you as an expert on these areas, clearly, how do you perceive, or how did you yes, perceive this categorization of the Three Seas Initiative, a completely independent project, still funded to a certain or to a larger extent with by the European Union, funds naturally by the member partners, but still as a counterbalance. Would you agree or disagree on this?
Well, I think definitely the China factor has been there from the very beginning. So the idea has been to really, for the countries in the region to have the ownership, to stress their agency in this, because it was 16 plus 1 was about China coming here and offering what they wanted to offer. And oftentimes there was this mismatch, as I was mentioning. They were offering something that the countries in the region were not very interested in such an extent as China perhaps thought they would. So definitely this aspect of countering or of build, providing something that's better than China's offer was present there. I mean, so far with the Three Seas initiative, we have definitely not seen the initiative bringing the results that I would say were hoped for at the very beginning, the inception of the initiative. And right now, I would say there's more focus within Three Seas initiative on actually specific connectivity projects, which seems to me that from 16 plus 1, this has really disappeared. And there's not really that much stress on this issue anymore. But I still think there's a lot of untapped potential in terms of connectivity issues in Central and Eastern Europe. And this is also related to the issue of the political relevance of Central and Eastern European countries, especially after the invasion of Ukraine. We have seen some of the countries spearheading the response, supporting Ukraine in military terms. This is something where also the political importance of these countries plays a role, and perhaps the idea of that they are the new engines, of European Union. But I think there's still, as I mentioned, a lot of untapped potential. We have not really seen that many projects under the Three Seas initiative materializing. So this is still an open question. This is not the existing basically deficiencies that these countries face in terms of like interconnection, especially the north-south links. This is still there. China hasn't solved it, and Three Seas initiative so far also hasn't really solved that issue.
Not true. I mean, I might agree with you that to a certain extent, the Three Seas Initiative partners, I mean, there is a broad consensus, and summit after summit, we see the results, but still there is much work to be done. I mean, there is still much ground to be covered, and the leading project, I mean, the Via Carpathia is the one that takes the crown these days, but still it's not completed, and still there are several projects energy related that also need to materialize. I mean, connectivity and well, smart connectivity and digitalization rank as the lowest projects that have received investment, for which actually China could fill this vacuum. I mean, you have China, a powerhouse on technology, investing in semiconductors, investing in technologies, investing in smart connectivity related subjects, and this could be definitely a vacuum that they could fill in. Now, you mentioned also correctly is whether member states would be willing to accept these investments or this assistance in technology, right? I would like to ask you one of the questions. I mean, drawing on the lines you mentioned the war in Ukraine. Now, looking at or considering the changing global geopolitical landscape, also considering the Chinese current down pattern. I mean, China has seen that it's not growing as much as it had been for the previous years. Some people call it a meltdown. Some people call it the decrease of growth pattern. I mean, several terms are used precisely not to erupt a panic in the financial sector, right? So, I mean,
Hmm.
you have the war in Ukraine, you have the political, let's say, role, the Chinese role in there as a sort of mediator. I mean, we saw it during the Green Deal, but now we see Xi Jinping also during the BRICS summit a little bit skeptical. He disappeared for a few hours as well. So, looking at all these geopolitical themes and events, what is your best guess or analysis as how do you envision China's role evolving in Central Eastern Europe?
That's of course a big question relates to China's overall, path of socio-economic development and also its, geopolitical standing. Just on that issue, I think we're often thinking about China as the, either conquering the whole world or, just completely imploding. So I don't think this is going to happen. So even if China is going to enter a period of more significant, economic difficulties, it's just not going to disappear. It's going to be a major power I think, for decades to come. And it's going to also be a factor in Central and Eastern Europe. So I think it's really interesting to have this mind experiment about China's role in the region, and we're seeing that uh, China has re-emerged, as I mentioned, as a geopolitical actor in Central and Eastern Europe and in Europe as a whole. We have seen that through China's endorsement of Russia's strategic interest in the region, even before the eruption of the war in Beijing, the infamous now meeting between Xi Jinping and Putin, where China basically supported interest of Russia to rebuild, to reconstruct the European security architecture. And this, of course, very directly impacts security, very essential security of countries in Central and Eastern Europe. And now we're seeing also that China is positioning itself to play perhaps, or just trying to portray itself as potentially playing a role in resolving the conflict in Ukraine. I'm pretty skeptical about that. But I think when it comes to that, when actually we will see the resolution of the war, it's also going to be a big issue of about what China's involvement in Ukraine will be. And there's this huge issue of course, post-war reconstruction, and in Ukraine, we're actually seeing that the leadership in Kiev is being much more open towards China than you would assume, especially considering like the views of its main allies and the U.S. and also the European countries, which have really also pushed uh, China to basically not support Russia in the war and to also condemn Russia. But for Ukraine, we have seen that they have been very wary of basically turning China completely against Ukraine and to Russia's side. And there's also the question, of course, whether China is going to be involved, in terms of rebuilding infrastructure, in terms of, digital infrastructure, and all that. So I think this is going to be a big issue. And when the war ultimately comes to an end, this is going to be something that the whole Europe will have to grapple with.
be a little bit skeptic on creating a new dependency. Let's frame it that way. I mean, you depart from the dependency of Russia for gas and oil, and then you create a new dependency for, let's say, digitalization or infrastructure from another actor who was previous or who still is a major partner to Russia. Now, on those same lines, and departing from the war in Ukraine, I mean, you have extensively worked on the topic of disinformation, and now disinformation is one of the leading toolkits that Russia has employed in Central and Eastern Europe, particularly in the four countries. Now, very short, how, in your own takes and in your own experience, how does Russian and Chinese disinformation differ? I mean, they pursue different objectives, they pursue different techniques. What is your initial analysis on this?
Sure. So I would maybe more broadly talk about activities in the information space, let's say. And in this perspective, China used to be much more passive, and it used to focus mostly on basically defending its image, defending its interests. So very much focusing on actually Chinese domestic issues and how these issues were portrayed abroad. Of course, then the issue of Taiwan, which China as well sees as a domestic issue, but basically focusing on some core interests of China, oftentimes more focusing on spreading the positive energy, which is the terminology that they use, basically portraying China as a advanced, peaceful power that is interested in peaceful development with good ties with everyone without precondition to political systems or ideological differences and all that. So it was all about that. In the past few years, we have seen a change in that, and this has been related also to the globalization, you could say, of some China-related narratives, because China has become much more important to be a part of global conversation. The first step in that was actually the Hong Kong protests and the development in Hong Kong, and when China started to be much more active and I would say assertive in terms of establishing its narrative. Oftentimes, it was actually related to spreading disinformation about the background of the protests, saying that they're orchestrated by foreign agents, by CIA, by NED, typical conspiracy stuff, basically. But really, we have seen a huge change, like really change how China behaved with COVID-19 and the pandemic, where China was trying to change the global narrative about who was actually responsible for the outbreak of the pandemic, and spreading especially anti-American narratives and conspiracies that the pandemic was brought to China by basically U.S. visiting soldiers who were visiting the armed forces Olympics. I'm not sure what specifically that was, but many narratives like that were trying to basically disassociate China from the pandemic. And here we have seen a lot of learning from Russia, also in terms of using different narratives, not one specific one, but trying to spread basically this idea that we just don't know, what the truth is, so that people are really unsure about that. So this has been a great change in terms of China's narratives, but I would say the overall in terms of its information efforts in Europe, while Russia is trying to mostly you could say sow chaos, try to basically attack the integrity of democracies, of liberal values. China has been, I would say, apart from defending its image, um, still trying to mostly, use the narratives to help its geopolitical interests. And when we're talking about Europe as such, uh, the most important, the overarching China's interest is to uh, grow the EU and the US apart. So we have seen a lot of anti-US narratives spread by China, not so much anti-European ones. So it's actually about trying to portray China as a pragmatic partner for the European countries who's interested in unimpeded trade that is against decoupling and all that, and it's saying these are all a result of U.S. pressure. So we're still seeing more, I would say, like positive aspects of Chinese narratives, but we have seen during COVID that they can also show their sharp edge.
Right. So it is true that there was a period of silence before the COVID, and then during the COVID pandemic, it spiked. I mean, predominantly because there was a lot of information as well blaming China. So it was as their side of countering what they
Sure.
perceived as misinformation, right? I mean, it's a back and forth ping pong tactic, pretty much pursued. If it's not exerting the influence, it is countering what they perceive as influence, which is also kind of misleading as well, and hard to understand from their perspective. Um, Looking at this, I mean, Chinese influence is certainly not resulting as expected. I will dare to say. Russian disinformation practices, or as you call it, activities in cyberspace or in the information sphere, are far more effective. I would say, is particularly it's seen in Slovakia. I mean, China is not that much, but still, we see a countering activity. Particularly, well, it seems that it's not working to portraying their good image if Italy just filed their withdrawal from the Belt and Road Initiative. What can you tell us about this?
So yes, I would say that China has not been very effective in uh, making its image better. Of course, in Europe, we're seeing across the board basically that China's image has worsened in past several years. We're seeing that also in other Western countries, the U.S., Canada, Australia, Japan, South Korea. Uh, so that's definitely the case. What I would also say, and when you're talking about China's influence, that there's a huge role to be played by domestic agency. So when we're saying that China has influence in some country, it's usually because there is a government that finds China useful to pursue its own domestic political goals. The best examples are, of course, Hungary and
Mm.
Serbia. For example, in basically in both cases, the governments are presenting China first as a very important source of funds, for the country, bringing employment, bringing investment, and all that. And second, as also some kind of geopolitical, another geopolitical pole or some kind of leverage that they can use against the EU or against the West in general. So I would say it's often more about these countries actually leveraging China to achieve what they want, and if it meets with China's interests, then of course this can work pretty well. Um, when it doesn't really work, and what we have seen, for example, in the Czech Republic, where the government was very much, and the president here was very much in favor of close relationship with China, but it has not really brought any significant results. I mean, if you compare it with Serbia, especially, you cannot say that relationship with China has not brought results because China has actually the last data show it's the most significant foreign investor in country, basically in Serbia, more than all the EU countries combined. So this is a very different picture in Czech Republic, for example. But in Czech Republic, when you didn't really have any results, and also the population was not really on board, you would actually see a lot of backlash against that. So also this the issue of domestic agency many times is can be a double-edged sword, because it can actually, with China is relying too much on some particular political establishment. When the establishment changes, then suddenly you don't really have that much influence to speak of. So that's why I rather speak about the interplay of the domestic agency and China's activities, because Otherwise, it would be very difficult to explain how basically from one day to another, with the change of government, suddenly China cannot really do much or affect the developments in the country.
Right. No, this is great and rich analysis. Thank you for this. Because you bring into perspective how actually these countries, Hungary and Serbia, utilize China to their own benefit. I mean, to a certain extent, Montenegro did the same. However, Montenegro was unable to succeed at that stage, and unfortunately had to forgo one of the biggest infrastructure investments in the country. Right. Um, so with this note, I mean, how can we four countries, but let's open the region, Central Eastern European countries, also the Baltics. I mean, the Baltics that still have a certain, with the exception of Lithuania. But in general, how can Central European countries effectively balance their engagement with China, the European Union, and other international partners? I mean, you mentioned some key points that when it serves also their own interests and their own agenda. I mean, it's certainly possible. Let me just say a note for our viewers as well. I mean, it is not that China should be antagonized, but should be carefully approached. Am I correct, or would you disagree with this affirmation?
Definitely, and I think this is what everybody right now broadly agrees on, because there has been this debate between decoupling and some other approaches which now have been termed de-risking. So basically everybody's saying that we do want to cooperate with China, but there are some risks that are related to that, and we have to be aware of these risks and we have to address them. So I think that's basically this approach, thusly defined, makes sense. But of course, then when you go into specifics, it gets much more difficult, because you're saying China's involvement in this sector, let's say 5G, is problematic, and we do not want that, which is also the direction where the EU is going, like recently very explicitly saying that basically Chinese suppliers should not be part of 5G networks in the EU countries. But what then are the areas where we actually can see Chinese involvement? So I think there is, of course, the issue of what I mentioned, the Chinese investments in green energy, and of course, huge debate. I would say that the most important debate that is going around in Europe, or at least one of those, is how to really succeed in the green transformation of European industry and whole economies. And it's really difficult to do that without China. So on the one hand, uh, the EU is doing a lot in terms of actually studying what are the dependencies that there are on China. We know about the dependencies in critical raw materials, but also in specific technologies that we have, where China has basically almost monopolized these whole supply chains. Uh, at the same time, we are, for example, seeing the Chinese investment in the sector. So I think there can be some kind of basically operating more mode where we can still cooperate to mutual benefit. But of course, we also have to be aware of a very real potential that the economic risks, the economic relations between China and the EU will be severed. In case of a conflict in whether it's South China Sea or whether it's over Taiwan. So this is a very real risk. So I think there needs to be a lot of de-risking in specific areas, but it's probably not possible to completely prepare for such a scenario. And if such a scenario comes to take place, then we're looking into complete decoupling of the economies, whether we want it or not. So this is definitely a defining issue that is going to be present there in China-EU relations. So I'm cautiously optimistic about cooperation in specific areas, and we're seeing that on the ground. But there's also going to be a lot of different directions of that. on one hand, cooperation in some areas, on the other hand, trying to de-risk in others.
Right. No, that's correct. And I mean, you properly mentioned, I mean, the fact that green energies are going to be the leading topic of conversation. I mean, the green transition. And well, investment has to be present. And most of the investment, as I mentioned, I mean, this could be a vacuum that until now, I mean, if the majority of the investment goes to transportation or digitalization and less to green energy, I mean, one of the leading topics, well, one of the least leading topics out there being discussed at the 3Cs Initiative Summit is how to mitigate green gases. Well, precisely, we're pushing for this transportation and digitalization projects, but at the same time, we are sort of overlooking the impact assessments and the environment, which is definitely something that will pay a check in the next coming years when the projects already materialize. And this is something, a point to look after. Well, I believe we have covered most of the questions that we wanted to address. We have discussed several topics. For sure, I hope this can be the starting point of a series of events as well about China in Central Eastern Europe. Philip, I would like to thank you on behalf of the Warsaw Institute for taking the time to share with us these preliminary insights about Chinese influence and Chinese presence in Central Eastern Europe, particularly in V4 countries. Thank you very much, Philip, and until next time.
Thank you very much. It was a very nice conversation. We have touched upon a lot of topics. I mean, you could go much deeper into all of them, but I think it's overall it's basically a time of transformation or a period of transformation for China's role in the region. So I think it could take, all directions. It can decrease in importance, which we have seen in the past few years, but also there's a lot of openings for China. So we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the leading patterns that we're seeing is sort of a rejection. I mean, could you agree with me, or would you agree with me that precisely because we see a different turn of events and a rapidly evolving geopolitical landscape. I mean, you mentioned Taiwan there, and certainly the U.S. will take a look at Taiwan. But then, would that issue in the Indo-Pacific affect how China perceives also Europe, or would it extend this extra arm, knowing that it might be an arm of support, perhaps? I mean, finding allies such as Hungary, or as you mentioned, Serbia, even the Czech Republic. I mean, let's say to extend or overextend its influence. I mean, be that commercial, be that on its manufacture. I mean, all of these developments are still yet to be seen, indeed.
Sure, I do completely agree. I mean, and that Taiwan and the risk of a contingency there is going to be a shadow over the development of EU-China ties, and definitely one of the interests, as I mentioned, in terms of strategic interests of China towards Europe is uh, to have the EU basically stand on the side if a conflict happens.
Right. Well, Philip, once again, thank you very much for taking the time, and I'll make sure to keep you around for our next round of events on China in Central Eastern Europe.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.